Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Food for Thought, the lecture series of the Alabama Department of Archives and History. My name is Scotty Kirkland, and I serve as the Exhibits, Publications, and Programs Coordinator at the Archives. Before we begin today's program, I have a few announcements for you. Registration is now open for the 2021 Alabama History Institutes. Sponsored by the Archives, these institutes offer immersive professional development opportunities in history, civics, for public, private, and homeschool K-12 educators in Alabama. 13 three-day workshops will be held in locations across the state beginning in June. Each workshop will incorporate intensive classroom training, interactive hands-on experience at local museums, parks, and historic sites. Participants will receive a stipend and a professional development credit. Space for the 2021 institutes is very limited. Registration ends on April the 8th. You can find more information on the Archives website. On Tuesday, March 30th at noon, the Archives will host a virtual book talk with Carol Ann King, co-author of Alabama Quilts. This newly released publication features quilts made before Alabama became a state through the middle of the 20th century. It explores the context of these Alabama quilts, communities and times in which they were created, the lives of their makers, and the time and events for which they were made. Carol Ann King will discuss the book and her co-author, the late Mary Elizabeth Johnson Huff, and the nearly 2 decades-long process of bringing the book to fruition. You can watch the program right here online at noon on March 30th. Finally, be sure to join us for our next virtual Food for Thought. The program will be April 15th, the third Thursday in April, where historian Dr. Burtis English will discuss African Americans in higher education in post-Reconstruction Alabama, 1867 to 1881, excuse me. It's my pleasure to introduce today Briana Royster. She's our speaker. Briana is an Alabama native and a doctoral candidate at New York University. She specializes in the African diaspora with a focus on the United States, Latin America, and the Caribbean. She received degrees in history and women's studies from the University of Alabama. Her topic today is the interesting and inspiring story of Indiana Little, an early African American suffragist. A programming note, today's presentation has been pre-recorded to accommodate a prior commitment of the speaker. We encourage you to still post your questions and comments in the chat function, and we will answer as many as we can. Ms. Royster, welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank Scotty and Mary and also Alex and everyone really involved with Food for Thought for asking me to come. It's absolutely a joy. Right, and it's interesting because you also had one of my former professors, Dr. Hillary Green, last month. So it's really, really wonderful to be here. But with that, I will go ahead and get started. To talk to you a little bit about Indiana Little, who is a woman that I've grown really attached to over the last few years since I was first introduced to her in, I think, 2014. So I'll get started. On the morning of January 18th, 1926, years after the ratification of the 19th Amendment, and years prior to what we think of as the classic phase of the Civil Rights Movement, several African American men and women hoping to register to vote made their way to the county registrar's office in Birmingham, Alabama. Indiana Little, a prominent African American Birmingham woman, led the way. Unsurprisingly, officials did not allow the Birmingham residents to register to vote. And according to one report, officials assaulted Mrs. Little. While it appears that no one recorded the aftermath concerning the other men and women, police arrested Mrs. Little, charged her with vagrancy, and held her on a $300 bond. Little's act of defiance not only made headlines across Alabama, but also attracted national news coverage in African American-owned newspapers and sparked a subsequent demonstration in Birmingham. But before I get into Indiana Little's march, I would like to tell you a little bit about her, or at least what I've been able to piece together so far. Right? And this, what's currently showing, is the only picture I've been able to find of her. Documentation, as I said, about her life is fairly sparse. But this picture was used in a 1926 article that was about her march and about the fight that transpired. So Indiana's maiden name is Tuggle. Right? Indiana Tuggle was born in Wyatt, Georgia on April 15th, 1897, to George and Harriet Tuggle. George and Harriet both worked as farm laborers in Georgia. Her father was qualified to vote in Georgia in 1867, but it's not really clear whether or not he did. Indiana was the 8th of 9 children. Through later census records, I know that Indiana married Terrell Little in 1918. He was 10 years her senior, and they eventually had 2 daughters, Leslie and Elise, prior to leaving Georgia for Alabama in 1923. So I know it's a little difficult to read the census record, but what I have here is the census record for the Tuggle family in 1900 in Georgia. And so Indiana is in the highlighted portion. She's second from the bottom. Right, and if you can't see her age is listed as 3. Her birth month is in April. Said she was born in 1897. But we can also see, right, that her, again, I know it's difficult to read, but that everyone in her family above the age of 13, they're listed as either farmers or farm laborers. And her siblings who are 13 and above are able to read and write, but her parents are not. It is assumed, but not for certain, that her parents were born into slavery in Georgia. Her father was born in 1850, and it's a little bit more difficult to read, but I think her mother was born in 1857, but we're not quite sure. But this is the census record for her family, and one of the very few pieces that I was actually able to find out, few pieces of documentation that I was able to find about her family prior to the 1923 move to Alabama with her husband and her daughters. So she quickly immersed herself in Birmingham's African American community after the move in 1923. And some considered her a, quote, prominent and well-respected, unquote, member in the area. Even with the ratification of the 19th Amendment in 1920, it's widely known that white officials in the South rarely allowed African American citizens to vote, even still. So on the morning of January 18th, 1926, Indiana Little led a march of African American men and women to the registrar's office. The reported number of those involved in the march ranged from the hundreds to 1,000, and one document that I'll show you later says 25. So it's not for certain, but more than one document does at least say 100. So somewhere from 25 to 1,000, we're not quite sure. But while at the registrar's office, Little reportedly stated, "I am a freeborn citizen of America, and by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, I shall not be denied the right to vote because of my race, color, or sex, and I will not move until I have been registered." So I actually love this quote, right? And so she makes a few very right, declarative statements here, right? She says, "I am a freeborn citizen of America, and by the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution, I shall not be denied the right to vote for these reasons." And so what she does is, right, she's challenging the legality of what is happening to her in Birmingham. And by her saying, "I will not move," she's actually putting her body, right, on the line in a certain way that I actually think is really admirable, right? And also very courageous given this time period, is 1926. So, of course, right, city officials did not allow Little and her followers to register to vote at this time. Moreover, officials arrested and beat Little for her efforts. Local, state, and national newspapers such as the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and the Chicago Defender covered the march and expressed outrage at Little's arrest. Little's march also sparked subsequent marches in later years. And so far, I've been able to find references to Little's march through 1930. So for about 4 years, you're still seeing comments about this march and about how other marches happened because they were inspired by her up through 1930, so 4 years. Right. So that is kind of a quick summary of the march, but we have newspaper clippings and even Mrs. Little's own testimony for a more complete story of what happened. So I'm going to share some of those. Again, I know it's a little fuzzy, so I will read them to you. But this clipping is from Baton Rouge, and it uses the phrase, "another group of Negro voters made application today," which lets us know that Indiana and her group were not the first and they weren't the last, right? It was a continuous effort, which I'll speak just a little bit more about in a moment. But because it's fuzzy, I will read this entire short document for you all. So another group of Negro voters made application for registration at the office of the county registrar here, meaning Birmingham, Tuesday. Close on the heels of a scene enacted Monday, in the county building where Indiana Little, who led a party of Negro women to register, was sent to jail on a charge of vagrancy. The group who made application Tuesday filled out necessary blanks and followed the usual routine in an orderly manner. It was charged by clerks in the registrar's office Monday that Indiana Little had become boisterous and created a disturbance. She alleged that red tape had kept her group from registering. The woman is under appearance and peace bonds. And so a few things are happening in this report, right? You see, right, this claim that they were boisterous and that they caused a disturbance and that this is why they couldn't register. But you also see there's a reference to Indiana Little saying that red tape is the true reason why she couldn't register to vote. And you'll actually see her repeat that again to another newspaper, right? Red tape is what keeps the group from voting. But again, the first part mentions, right, that this is right, something else, how another group comes in Tuesday, right? Indiana's march was on the previous day on Monday. And then this Tuesday, another group is in trying to register to vote. So again, this is a continuous effort. Right. This next clip is from the Birmingham Reporter, or clipping, I should say. It's from the Birmingham Reporter. And I just love it, right? I think it's a good example of how big the story was in Birmingham. You can see Mrs. Little received the top headline. And you can also see the other stories that are happening around it and at the same time that she right, kind of overshot in a sense, right? Her story kind of took precedence over these other stories. So the Birmingham newspaper was a Black-owned newspaper. As you can see at the very top, it says it's the official organ of the Masons, Eastern Stars, and Knights of Pythias of Alabama. And so they write this story on Indiana Little, right? Woman's color causes assault. Mrs. Little is jailed when she refuses to leave registrar's office. And you can see, of course, these other stories. Indiana's story is directly in the middle, but you see what's around it, right? Jury acquits a Mississippian charged with lynching. A congressman defends a Negro soldier. Teachers are meeting. So there's a lot going on, but the fact that her story still takes the main headline for this newspaper seems very important to me, right? That this was a big deal, especially for Black citizens in Alabama. This next headline is from the Chicago Defender, right? And it very clearly stresses the violence of what happened that day, right? Ask ballots in Alabama, get beating, right? So I like the juxtaposition of this, right? Something as simple as asking for a ballot, right? Asking to vote in Alabama gets you beaten. The Chicago Defender is very clear about this. It also says, woman thrashed for trying to vote, right? Because she has asked for the right to vote, Mrs. Indiana Little, well known in this city, was thrashed by a white registration officer last Monday. And so again, you speak a little bit, or this actually speaks a little bit to the violence that occurred here. But the Chicago Defender at this time has such a wide publication audience. So at this point, it is definitely, and this is January 30th, right, it's definitely huge national news that many people all over the nation are seeing. So it isn't just remaining, part of the Birmingham community. Right? At this point, several other outlets have gotten wind of the story. Right? So we have the Defender, you had the clipping from Birmingham, also the clipping from Louisiana, and this clipping is from the Pittsburgh Courier. And it gives us a little bit more information and a few quotes from Little, but also from the registration officer involved. And his name was L.K. Bowen. And I think, I haven't been able to verify for sure, but I think he may have been a state representative for Jefferson County in the 1920s. But I haven't been able to definitely identify that it's the same man. But through this clipping in the Courier, but also from other newspaper clippings, we have quotes of Bowen saying, initially, he's calling voting, quote, a white man's business, unquote. And he states at one point that too many, quote, N-words were trying to vote anyway, unquote. All right. But once he realizes federal officers are in town, which I'll tell you why in just a moment, he later says that all persons are accorded the same treatment in applying for registration certificates. A number of Negro voters registered. Applicants are required to pass a certain intelligence test before they are qualified, and it was this barrier that caused the disagreement with a group of Negroes and clerks on Monday. So I think it's very well documented, right, that there were intelligence tests that African Americans had to take. There were poll taxes a little earlier on, right? There were grandfather clauses, all to keep Black citizens disenfranchised, right? But I'll read just a little bit from the Pittsburgh Courier in case you are unable to see it, because these scans I know are a bit fuzzy. But the first part is actually the quote that I read to you all earlier from Indiana Little, where she says, "I am a freeborn citizen of America, and by the 14th Amendment and the US Constitution, I shall not be denied the right to vote because of race, color, or sex, and I will not move until I have been registered." These words, spoken in a decisive voice by Mrs. Indiana Little, prominent in local circles at the office of the county registrar, L.K. Bowen, led to her arrest on a charge of vagrancy and resisting an officer, and precipitated a sensation among Negroes here. Mrs. Little headed a delegation of 25 race people, mostly women, who demanded that they be allowed to register as voters and be issued a certificate of registration immediately. Bowen declined to accept their registration until he had examined registration papers filled out by them in accordance with election laws. The women claimed that these messages were only red tape to keep us from voting. Mrs. Little was placed under appearance and peace bonds. The arrest of Mrs. Little brought to light the fact that the Department of Justice agents from Washington had been in Birmingham for a week or more, making investigation into the method of registering voters. Some Negro voters registered on Tuesday, as a previous article stated. It is said that quite a large number of Negroes made application for registration at the office of the county registrar following the incident on Monday, which resulted in the arrest of Mrs. Little. According to attaches of Election Commissioner's Office, Negroes made out the application Tuesday and filled out the necessary blanks and followed the usual routine in an orderly manner. When it became known that federal agents were observing the registration procedure here, it is said that county registrar issued a statement, which he said, all persons are accorded the same treatment in applying to registration certificates. A number of Negro voters registered. Applicants are required to pass a certain intelligence test before they are qualified, and it was this barrier that caused the disagreement within the group of Negroes and the clerks on Monday. So again, right, you have this kind of changing in Bowen's language from a previous quote. So the quote where he says it is a white man's business and too many of the N-words were trying to vote, that comes from the Birmingham News. And I I apologize, I don't have a clip of it, but it comes from the Birmingham News. So the Birmingham News is also covering this story for quite a while. You can see it off and on about what is happening. And in the Birmingham News, right, this is right, spoken about as, quote, a ruckus. Right, they talk about how Black people are getting out of their place in Birmingham. And so there's definitely a difference in the way that this is covered in a white-owned press, but also versus a Black-owned press like the Courier and the Chicago Defender and the Birmingham Reporter. But I will say that this is more than a minor disagreement. Even as the Chicago Defender really talked about, stressed the violence that occurred that day, the Defender did not seemingly have access to a statement that Little made in a sworn affidavit. Little stated that she was, quote, carried by an officer that took her out of the Board of Registrar's office and locked her up, where she, unquote, where she was then, quote, beat over the head unmercifully and forced upon the officer's demand to yield to him in an unbecoming manner, unquote. Right. Little's complaint was not further investigated, but I will say that the officer or the agent who she made the complaint to did take it seriously enough to where he recommended that this, her accusation be investigated and followed up. And he received a reply that Birmingham did not have the manpower to do so. So this results in Little's accusation of assault not being any further up, and it just kind of disappeared, at least kind of as we know now from the historical record. But I will say, I think it's important to see, because we see how her defiant and bold stance also meant that she physically put her body on the line for the ability to be able to vote, which was a right that she already had, technically, right? So we know from other historians that sexual violence was a real threat to African American women. Other physical violence was also a major concern by 1940, and these stats come from the EJI in Montgomery, right? So by 1940, 30 people had been lynched in Jefferson County and over 300 in the state of Alabama. So the threat of physical violence, sexual violence, was very real. And I have to think, at least in my mind, right, like this has to be going through her mind when she makes the decision to lead this march, and in such a defiant and forceful way, given the atmosphere of Birmingham at the time. But still, she chose to lead the march. But unfortunately, right, as already stated, she was violently attacked for it. But her march again sparked other marches, right? Which again is important, right? This the influence that she has within the city and with other African Americans in the city is very important. So I know some may be wondering why or how was Little able to give an affidavit. So as I previously mentioned, this wasn't the first time that African Americans, both men and women, had trouble voting after 1920. Dr. Liette Gitlow has uncovered complaints written to President Coolidge prior to Little's march. The letters are from African American soldiers, but they're also from their wives and from women relatives. And the claims, according to Dr. Gitlow's article, right, they're making claims upon, right, I have served this country and you are not defending my rights, right? This country is not giving me what I am owed. It's not giving me what I deserve. There are problems here, and they write to President Coolidge to look into them. And so eventually it prompts an investigation, and agents happen to be in town when Little led men and women to the registrar's office in 1926. And I don't know for certain, but I have to think, given if she was connected to the community, if she was thought of as, quote, a prominent and well-respected woman in the Black community in Birmingham, I have to think that she knew this, that she knew agents would be in town. And if she did, just kind of the savviness of what she did, right? She goes in knowing agents are in town, knowing that agents are watching this process, and kind of forces their hand a little bit. And so while she was unable to register to vote, the people who went in the following Tuesday were, right? But in Dr. Gitlow's article, which is titled The Sequel, the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, and Southern Black Women's Struggle to Vote, there is an example of the suppression tactics used in Jefferson County. So Dr. Gitlow writes, in Alabama, a county registrar recounted years later to political scientist Ralph Bunch how his office worked to discourage African-American women who tried to register. Way back in 1920, the registrar recalled, we had a world of N-word women coming in to register. There was a dozen of them, I reckon, come in one registration period. We registered a few of them and then we put them off. Tell them they had to bring in white witnesses, tell them how much poll tax it was going to cost them, unquote. So by the time Little marches, we know that this is an ongoing thing, right? And she wasn't the only one. So Professor Gitlow also talks about a woman, I believe her name is Lula Murray, right, who was spearheading some of this, specifically in the early 1920s. And it's really a fascinating story, and I encourage you all to look up Professor Gitlow's article and the work that she does with Southern Black women, not just in Alabama, but it's really fascinating story. All right. So what happens to Indiana after the march? The truth is that we don't know very much. We just don't know. I have been able to find evidence of her. I have not actually been able to find evidence of her leading another march. I'm not sure about later activism, but through census records, we can get an idea and very small glimpse into her home life. So the census record here is from 1930. Her husband, Terrell, worked as a riveter in a foundry. Indiana was listed without an occupation this year. Her husband says could not read or write, and we'll find out later that her daughters could, right? But both girls attended school. And this is a little bit blown up, but it's still a little difficult to read, right? But they also rented their home. And so that's, about all that I was able to find through this census record. But Indiana Little is highlighted in yellow for this time period. By 1940, the couple and their older daughter continued to live together in Birmingham. Her husband, Terrell, worked as a laborer by this point, and she is listed as working as a maid. Leslie, who is now 22, is married, and she is the mother of a 3-year-old, and his name is Togo Bowen. Also employed as a maid. She's also employed as a maid, Leslie is. Yeah. Terrell was recorded as having gone to school through the 1st grade. We know Indiana went to school through the 7th. Leslie did graduate from high school. And through another document, we know that Indiana Little's husband Terrell, he earned $1,000 annually, and the family continued to rent their place. And so this is another kind of blown up snippet of that 1940 census record, where you can kind of see the family. And so I know that she remains in Birmingham, Indiana Little does. She actually raises the grandson that you actually see here. He's second from bottom in the highlighted portion, Togo Bowen. She actually raises him. We know that she finally votes in 1957. And through her obituary, I learned that she remained an active voice in her community and church as president of the Missionary Society, a Sunday school teacher, and the training union teacher at the 23rd Street Baptist Church in Birmingham until her death in September 22nd, 1970. So I think for me, Indiana Little's story is important because it brings attention to the struggles of African-American women after passage of the 19th Amendment, right? There are still women who are not voting after 1920. But I also think it demonstrates how Southern Black women were leading the charge for voting rights in many areas. And I think that's very important, right? What happens when we start to insert Southern Black women into the story of suffrage, right? The story changes a little bit, and we see this through Indiana Little and also through many other women. So I think it's very, very important to pay attention to her story and to pay attention to Black women, and specifically Southern Black women, and also rural Black women. So there's other work that I'm starting to look into about rural Black women, what they're doing. But I think what it does is it opens up opportunities for leadership where women aren't just necessarily working behind the scenes, but they're truly leading the charge for voting rights. I'm going to end with a quote from Lola Hendricks, who was an activist during the Civil Rights Movement in Birmingham. So we were the backbone, sometimes side by side with those men, because I know there were women in Birmingham that served as security guards along those men. There were women on the board. There were women who were working with the Treasury, finance membership. So we were very much involved. It's funny though, we don't get written about. We did not get written about, end quote. So I found that quote actually from a thesis in the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, going through the archives, right? Now, I know some people may ask, why would I end this presentation about a woman activist in the 1920s with a woman activist from the classic phase of the Civil Rights Movement in Birmingham? But I do so because they're connected. So as I stated, I found this quote in a thesis statement, a thesis at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and I worked there for a few months in 2014. And it was really a wonderful experience because they were going through a renovation, which meant that they were also going through and recataloging some of their archival documents. So I was able to go through a lot of boxes and a lot of finding aids. And I found this, but one thing that I found, actually let me back up, right? The reason I even found Indiana Little was because I was reading interviews and documents from women in the 1950s and 60s who were activists in Birmingham. And one woman mentioned Indiana's Little's March in 1926. And I thought, oh, this is so fascinating. But all of this is to say that there are lineages and that there are networks of Black women activists who were connected over time, right? Over voting rights, specifically for this presentation, but also over other issues. So there's not, there isn't like this one moment of suffrage in the 19-teens and 1920s, and then like no activism until the Civil Rights Movement later in the 50s and 60s. Like this is very much connected, is very much a continuous movement, and these networks, like they last, they persist, and these women know about each other, right? And so I guess the point is that Black women's activism, Southern Black women's activism, has always been there. And I think it's very important for us to pay attention to that and reinsert, again, Southern Black women into this story, right? And not just as being behind the scenes, but it's also leaders in what they are doing. So Black women's struggles for voting rights, of course, right, last beyond the 1920s and into the 1950s and 60s. But as Mrs. Hendricks says, they did not get written about. But thankfully, over the last few decades, scholars and local historians have changed that narrative. And these stories are becoming more well-known. And, there are a lot of, again, right, scholars and local historians who really are making these connections for us, making these stories more well-known and, more easily accessible. So I just think it's really fascinating. And I just love Indiana Little's story. Thank you all for listening. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. What an interesting presentation, and what great work, and what a good way to mark Women's History Month, but also mark the beginning of our return to thinking about the suffrage centennial now that we're all sort of emerging out of the events of the last year. So thank you very much for helping to kick us off here. I want to ask you a couple of questions
Sure.
before we go. Tell us how you first got to learn about Indiana Little and why you decided to research more into her life. I think those stories are always so interesting. When did Indiana Little find you?
Absolutely. She found me in 2014. So again, I was at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. I was very interested in a career in archives, and I volunteered for I think maybe 2 months, and then they brought me on as paid staff for the summer. And it was just the most wonderful time. Again, they were undergoing a renovation, so I was in the archives department, and while they were having to take all of their boxes down for the renovation, they asked me to go through and just basically check finding aids, right? Make sure everything was matching up since they had to take everything down anyway. And as I was doing that, right, the historian that I am, the bit of a geek that I am, I became a little overinvested. So rather than like quickly scanning and matching up, I became really interested in people's stories. And so I was going through one woman's interview, and she mentioned Indiana Little from 1926. And at the time, I had no idea that Black women were so active in the 1920s in Alabama. And from there, it just kind of snowballed. So I was actually a master's student at Alabama at the time in history, and I was getting ready to transition into my master's program in women's studies, right? So I graduated, I think, in May, and then was at the archives during the summer. And I just kept thinking, what else can I do with Indiana Little? And fortunately enough, as I mentioned, Dr. Green, who was your guest last month,
Sure.
I took a course with her, and she asked for us to write basically a seminar paper. And what I did in that paper is I connected Indiana Little to other Black women involved specifically with voting in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s, and talked about this idea of leadership and not just behind the scenes. So that is how I found her, and she has just stuck with me for years. She is not part of my dissertation. She is kind of a side passion project, but I hope to be able to continue to write about these connections from with her and with other women in the 1950s and 60s. Yeah.
Sure, sure. You showed us a few of the clips from some of the well-known African American newspapers of the day, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Chicago Defender, and those sources are so important in resurrecting these lesser known stories and these stories that otherwise would be lost to us. I wonder if Indiana Little's stand provoked any sort of response in other cities. Have you been able to find any comparable work by African American women in 1926 in other cities that maybe were a response to Indiana Little?
So unfortunately, I have not at this moment, at least not through newspapers that I've been able to track. Like they are definitely talking about her, but some of the marches that occur in other places, they aren't necessarily written as being connected to her march. But the ones in Birmingham, they specifically say, right, that we are marching because of what happened to Mrs. Little at the time. So, yeah, but they are definitely talking about her in newspapers everywhere. I found some newspapers in Kansas are mentioning her. St. Louis are mentioning her. I found one mentioned in New York. So yeah. Mm.
Did you ever find any record of her arrest or what might have happened to her afterwards? Did she have to stand trial? Did she or she didn't stand trial? Did she have to pay a fine? Was she released on the
Yeah.
bond?
As far as I know, it seems, I wish I could remember the exact language, but there is, so let me back up. The group that Dr. Gitlow writes about, the I think ex-soldiers Cooperative, I think is their name. They actually raised the funds, from what I'm able to gather, to actually get her out of jail, right? And so that is paid and she is released. I do not know if she stands trial. I have not been able to uncover that as of yet. Yeah. Mhm.
I want to ask you one last question. You ended with Lola Hendricks' comment, which
Mhm.
I think is really important. And you talked a little bit about this idea of sort of the long civil rights movement and how,
Right.
even in 1926, when Indiana Little is speaking, she's making that very important declarative statement, as you said in the beginning. She's connecting the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment and the 14th Amendment, really,
Yeah.
without even calling it forth. But she's also she's saying, I'm a person, I'm a citizen. She's making the same connections to somebodyness, to importance that would have been made in the 60s. And I think that's so interesting, that you've been able to find such a clear connection of somebody that shows this long movement theory, and that shows that it's something that can connect these stories in ways that don't keep them separate by eras. Tell me why you think that's important as we look at the stories of African American women in the South throughout the 20th century.
Yeah, no, absolutely. These connections, for me, are key. They're important. And when I saw the quote of what she said, like you, I was just amazed. I thought, oh, this is so great. This is wonderful. This is fascinating. But I think, right, like these connections and these quotes, and knowing particularly right the Constitution and the legality of what is happening, is hugely important. Specifically, as we think of, or as you give even public talks to. Um, People who may not be as familiar with this history, there sometimes can be, this idea that even if African Americans in the South were uneducated in some ways, or if they were illiterate, that they didn't know these things, right? And so I think it is very important to have her own words, right? That says, right, she is very aware of what the Constitution says she is supposed to be guaranteed, right? She's very aware of what her rights should be as a citizen, right? And she's very clear to say, I am a freeborn citizen here, right?
Right.
And so it's very important. And Professor Gitlow, in her article titled The Sequel, she talks about how women, I think around Birmingham, I think if I remember correctly, she's still specifically referring to Birmingham, but how they memorize, right? They memorize the language of the Constitution, and they use it when they go out and protest. They use it when they are writing to President Coolidge about the rights that they are being denied, right? This right to vote that they are being denied. So it's absolutely vital, absolutely important that they know this language, and that they don't shy away from using it at any moment. I think it's just right. It's so tremendously courageous, I think. I just
Yeah.
can't imagine. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. And I want to tell our viewers that you can learn more about Indiana Little and many other Alabama women on the website of the Alabama Women's Suffrage Centennial Committee. This is a group that was started in 2019 to prepare for the centennial. The website is alabamawomen100.org. We'll drop that in the chat feature for you with a link. There you'll find profiles of Alabama women, educator resources, and the Alabama Women's Journal, which features articles and illustrations on the work of Alabama women throughout the suffrage period and the civil rights era. We have a new article by our speaker that will be posted on the Alabama Women's Journal. So if you want to learn even more about Indiana Little, you can go and check out that article at alabamawomen100.org. And finally, like many of the cultural institutions and museums throughout the country, the archives delayed many of its commemorative events surrounding the centennial of the 19th Amendment last year, but they are coming back, we are happy to say. Stay tuned to our website and our social media for information about even more events, including our summer symposium and our special exhibit called Justice Not Favor, Alabama Women and the Vote. You'll be able to learn even more about these things soon, and you'll be able to visit the exhibit in person very soon. We're excited about that. A reminder to you that Food for Thought, which is now in its 31st year, is sponsored by the Friends of the Alabama Archives and the Alabama Humanities Alliance. And we thank them for their support. And we thank you for watching today, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.